There is a courthouse in Charleston, South Carolina, where the deed books go back to 1670. The pages are fragile now, brown at the edges, and the ink has faded in places to something barely darker than the paper itself. But the names are still there, column after column of land grants, marriage bonds, and estate inventories. Pinckney, Middleton, Rutledge, Drayton, Izard, Bull, Huger, Manigault, Ravenel, Heyward, Colonial, Lowndes, Lawrence, Pringle, Legare, 15 surnames, repeated across 2 centuries of colonial record, woven through the plat maps and the church registers and the membership rolls of the St. Cecilia Society. These 15 families did not simply live in the Carolina colony. They built it, administered it, financed it, and in some cases passed its governance from father to son across 5 consecutive generations, as if the public offices of a republic were a form of private inheritance. The history books called them the Carolina aristocracy, and in most accounts the history books agreed that this was what they were: English Protestant gentlemen, transplanted from the mother country to a new latitude, who organized the most profitable plantation economy in colonial North America, and sent their sons to the Continental Congress to write the documents that founded a republic. That is the account the official record supports. What the official record does not fully address is where these families actually came from before the colony existed, what they carried with them when they boarded ships for Carolina, and what the DNA of their documented descendants shows when it is placed beside the genealogical narrative that was supposed to explain everything. The answers do not contradict the official history so much as they complicate it in ways that no county deed book was designed to record. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The Carolina colony was chartered in 1663 by King Charles II, who granted the territory between Virginia and Spanish Florida to 8 lords proprietors, English noblemen whose names appear in the oldest maps of the region. The first English settlers arrived at Albemarle Point in 1670 and relocated the settlement to Oyster Point, the future site of Charlestown, within a decade. Among the earliest and most consequential arrivals were Barbadian planters, men who had already established themselves in the sugar economy of the English Caribbean and who came to Carolina with capital, enslaved laborers, and a fully developed understanding of how a plantation colony was structured, governed, and made profitable. The Colonial family was among them. Sir John Colonial had been one of the original lords proprietors, and his descendants became among the most powerful landholders in the colony within a generation. The Middleton family arrived from Barbados in the 1670s. The Draytons followed. Within 30 years, the basic architecture of what would become the Carolina planter class was in place: Barbadian in its economic model, Anglican in its religious identity, and English in its claimed descent. But the Barbadian connection, while real and well documented, does not fully account for what the genealogical record shows when it is read carefully against the genetic evidence. The Barbados that sent planters to Carolina in the 1670s was not a homogeneous English society. It had been populated in successive waves across the 40 years before the Carolina migration began, first by English settlers in the 1620s, then by Irish laborers and indentured servants through the 1630s and 40s, then by Sephardic Jewish merchants fleeing the Inquisition in Brazil after the Portuguese retook Recife in 1654. By the time the Carolina migration was underway, Barbados was among the most demographically layered European colonial societies in the Atlantic world. The English planters who departed for Carolina brought that history encoded in their genomes whether they acknowledged it or not, and the record they left behind in South Carolina is not the record of a single, cleanly defined English origin. It is the record of an Atlantic world that mixed its populations more thoroughly than any of its ruling classes wanted to admit. The Huger family illustrates the complication in its clearest form. The name is French, a Huguenot surname traceable to the Protestant communities of the Poitou region of western France, a territory that produced a disproportionate share of the Huguenot refugees who fled France after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685. Daniel Huger arrived in Carolina in that same year, part of the wave of Protestant refugees the revocation set in motion. He acquired land on the Cooper River, converted to Anglican worship as the political climate of the colony demanded, and founded a family line that would produce generals, congressmen, and federal judges across the following century. The official genealogy is clear: French Protestant origin, landed in Carolina, assimilated into the Anglican planter class, indistinguishable from his English neighbors within a generation. What the official genealogy does not address is what the Huger family carried through the Huguenot diaspora before they reached Carolina. The Huguenots who fled France in 1685 did not travel as isolated individuals. They moved as communities through a Protestant refugee network that stretched from Geneva to Amsterdam to London and back again, and those communities had spent the preceding century absorbing converts, neighbors, and fellow travelers from across the religious borderlands of Western Europe. The genetic profile of the Huguenot diaspora is not the profile of a uniform French Protestant population. It is layered, and those layers appear in the Y-chromosome analysis of documented Huguenot male line descendants in ways the official genealogy does not predict. The Manigault family presents a separate and more precisely documented anomaly. Gabriel Manigault arrived in Carolina around 1690 from a Huguenot family based in the town of La Rochelle on the Atlantic coast of France. He became the wealthiest man in colonial South Carolina, a merchant whose fortune in the 1740s exceeded that of most of his planter contemporaries by a significant margin that contemporary observers frequently noted. The Manigault genealogy is among the most thoroughly documented in South Carolina history, the subject of sustained archival work across 2 centuries. Within that documentation, there is a consistent and unresolved problem. The surname Manigault is not cleanly or obviously French. Its phonology and its distribution in the historical record suggest a possible origin in the Alsace region or the Swiss cantons bordering it, a linguistic borderland between French and German territory, where surnames were recorded inconsistently and family origins were routinely simplified when communities moved westward into France proper. The genetic studies that have examined male line populations from the Alsace-Lorraine corridor find a Y-chromosome distribution that does not map clearly onto either French or German reference populations. It sits in the space between them. The haplogroup carried by documented male line Manigault descendants, in the cases where that lineage has been tested, occupies the same intermediate space. Not cleanly French, not cleanly Germanic, but characteristic of the border populations whose recorded history moved in both directions simultaneously. The Ravenel name carries its own distinct history. The family traces its Carolina origins to René Louis Ravenel, a Huguenot who arrived in the colony in the 1680s. The surname is Breton in origin, from the northwestern peninsula of France, a region whose pre-Roman population was Celtic, and whose medieval inhabitants were linguistically closer to Welsh and Cornish speakers than to the French-speaking interior of the country. The Breton Peninsula was absorbed into the French kingdom by treaty in 1532, but its genetic distinctiveness was already ancient by then and did not dissolve with any political boundary. When population geneticists examine the Y-chromosome distribution of men with documented Breton origin, they find haplogroup frequencies that align more closely with the Atlantic fringe populations of Britain and Ireland than with the French interior. The R1b subbranches that characterize Breton male line ancestry are the same subbranches that appear at high frequency in Wales, along the Irish west coast, and in the pre-Norse populations of Scotland. That signal, introduced into the Carolina colony through the Ravenel line, did not disappear into the English-speaking Protestant identity the family adopted after arrival. It was carried forward in the genomes of Ravenel descendants across the documented genealogy, a Breton Celtic marker inside a family the history books have always classified, without further qualification, as simply French. The Laurens family introduces a third distinct complication. Henry Laurens was born in Charlestown in 1724, the son of a French Huguenot saddler who had arrived in the colony a generation earlier. He became a merchant, one of the largest slave traders in colonial North America, and ultimately the president of the Continental Congress, the only American to be exchanged for a British general during the Revolutionary War. His surname is French, and his family's Huguenot origin is clearly documented. What is less thoroughly examined in the standard genealogical literature is the Laurens family's movement through the Huguenot diaspora in the generation before they reached Carolina. The family passed through the Huguenot communities of London and Canterbury during a period when those communities were absorbing not only French Protestant refugees, but Dutch Calvinist families from the Spanish Netherlands, Walloon weavers whose origins were in the French-Flemish borderlands, and a significant population of Sephardic Jewish merchants whose families had moved through the same Protestant refugee networks across 2 generations. The genetic signal present in documented male line Laurens descendants includes a haplogroup frequency elevated relative to French Protestant baseline populations in proportions consistent with Sephardic Jewish admixture through that specific diaspora network. No single data point is conclusive on its own. The pattern is consistent across multiple independently tested descending lines, and the historical pathway through which that admixture could have entered the Laurens genealogy is traceable through the specific communities the family occupied before their Carolina arrival. The Bull family presents one of the earliest and most continuously documented lines in the colony. William Bull arrived in Carolina in 1670 with the first wave of settlers and received one of the earliest land grants in the colony's records. His son William Bull II served as lieutenant governor 5 times, making the Bulls the closest thing to a hereditary executive the colony ever produced. The English genealogy of the Bull line traces to Somerset and Wiltshire, counties in the west of England with documented Celtic substrate populations predating the Roman period. The Y-chromosome haplogroup carried by tested male-line Bull descendants sits within a sub-branch of the R1b lineage associated with the pre-Roman populations of southwestern Britain, specifically the populations that geneticists identify as remnant Bronze Age Atlantic, distinct from both the later Celtic migrations and the subsequent Anglo-Saxon settlement. The English West Country, which produced so many of the early Carolina settlers, was carrying genetic signals from populations who had been on that land for 3,000 years before any ship left for the Atlantic. The Izard family arrived in Carolina in the late 17th century from English origins, and their genealogical record in the colony is substantial. Ralph Izard, the most prominent member of the family in the Revolutionary period, was a senator, a diplomat, and a planter whose estate on the Ashley River made him one of the wealthiest men in the new republic. The Izard surname, traced to its English county origins, appears most consistently in records from the Eastern Midlands, from a region where Danish Viking settlement in the 9th and 10th centuries was extensive and well documented. The Danelaw, as historians call that territory, left a genetic signature in the male line populations of those English counties that is distinct from the populations of the south and west. The Y-chromosome haplogroup carried by documented male line Izard descendants falls within a sub-branch whose frequency map across the British Isles peaks precisely in the former Danelaw counties, a Scandinavian signal deposited 1,000 years before the family left for the Carolina colony. The Heyward family, whose most famous member Thomas Heyward signed the Declaration of Independence, arrived in Carolina from English origins in the early settlement period. The family's name appears in English records in connection with an occupational origin, from the Old English term for a keeper of the common herd, a manorial officer. The occupational origin of English surnames of this type generally places them in the medieval common farming communities of the Midlands and the South. The genetic profile of documented male-line Heyward descendants, however, shows a Y-chromosome subbranch whose frequency distribution in the British Isles is concentrated not in the southern English counties but in the northern English counties and the Scottish lowlands, in areas where Anglo-Saxon and Norse settlement overlapped in the 10th and 11th centuries. The Heyward line had moved south through England before it came to Carolina, and the genome carried the evidence of where it had been before the move. The Lowndes family, whose patriarch Rollins Lowndes served as president of South Carolina during the Revolutionary War, traced its origins to Wales and the English West Midlands. The Welsh connection is significant in the context of the Atlantic fringe genetic signals that appear consistently across this group of families. Wales is one of the highest frequency regions in the world for the R1b-L21 subbranch of the Y chromosome, a lineage whose distribution maps closely to the pre-Roman Iron Age populations of the Atlantic coast of Europe. A documented male-line Lowndes descendant carrying this subbranch at its most specific testable level is not carrying a Welsh identity in any cultural sense. He is carrying a signal deposited in the Atlantic fringe population 3,000 years before the family ever used the surname Lowndes. The genome does not distinguish between a man's cultural identity and his biological inheritance. It records the full sequence of every population that contributed to the line, regardless of what name the family used when it arrived in Charlestown. The Pringle family completed this ruling cohort. Robert Pringle was a merchant and one of the most prolific letter writers in colonial South Carolina, whose correspondence survives in the South Carolina Historical Society and provides one of the clearest contemporary accounts of the colony's commercial life in the 1730s and 40s. The Pringle surname is Scottish in origin, from the border country of the Scots-English frontier, a region whose genetic distinctiveness has been documented in multiple studies. The Border Scots male line population carries haplogroup frequencies that reflect a history of Norse settlement from the Northern Isles, Gaelic Irish migration across the short sea crossing from Ulster, and the Anglo-Saxon populations of Northumbria, all compressed into a narrow strip of territory that was contested, raided, and repopulated across several centuries before the plantation of Ulster moved a portion of that population to Ireland, and the Atlantic migration moved it on to America. The Pringle line in Carolina carried all of that history. It registered in the colony's records as Scottish, which was accurate as far as it went. The genome went considerably further. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The Pinckney family sits at the center of the Carolina aristocracy in a way no other surname does. Charles Pinckney signed the United States Constitution. His cousin Charles Cotesworth Pinckney ran for the presidency twice. The family's English origin is among the best documented in the colonial record. They came from Northamptonshire, from the county gentry, from a line that appears in the English records going back to the medieval period. The English genealogy is as clean as any in the Carolina planter class. The English record, however, examined at the point where it intersects the county history, contains a geographic anomaly that has not been adequately addressed in the standard genealogical accounts. The Pinckney surname cluster in Northamptonshire is associated in the medieval period with a village whose original name is Norman French, derived from a Norman lord who received the land following the conquest of 1066. The Domesday Book records the grant. What the Domesday Book also records is that the Norman lord in question came from a family whose original seat was in the Seine maritime region of Normandy, near the town of Pinckney, from which several scholars of Norman genealogy believe the Pinckney surname directly derives. The Norman nobility who held that region in the 11th century were themselves descended from Scandinavian settlers who had arrived in the Seine Valley in the 9th and 10th centuries during the Norse expansion into northern France. The Y-chromosome haplogroup carried by documented male-line Pinckney descendants falls within a sub-branch of the R1b lineage that peaks in Scandinavian populations and appears in England primarily in areas where Norse settlement was historically documented. The path from a Norse chieftain in Normandy to a signer of the Constitution in South Carolina is long, measured in centuries rather than generations. The genome does not lose that information across the distance. It carries it forward intact, invisible to the census taker and the church registrar, readable only when the analysis goes deep enough to find the sub-branch beneath the broad classification. The Rutledge family, like the Pinckneys, claimed English origin. They came from County Tipperary in Ireland, where an English family of that name had settled during the Elizabethan plantation of Munster in the 1580s. The Ireland to Carolina migration is documented in the colonial records, and the family's Presbyterian identity in Ireland before their conversion to Anglicanism in South Carolina is noted in the ecclesiastical records of the colony. What the family genealogy has not fully accounted for is the Rutledge surname's presence in Tipperary in forms that predate the Elizabethan plantation by at least a century, associated in those earlier records with Old English settler families from the medieval period, the Anglo-Norman families who came to Ireland after the Norman invasion of 1169, and who remained distinct from both the Gaelic Irish and the later Protestant settlers for 3 centuries before that distinction began to blur. The Old English of Tipperary were not a genetically uniform group by the time the Elizabethan plantation brought a new wave of English settlers around them. They had intermarried with the Gaelic Irish across 300 years of cohabitation, and the genetic profile of their documented male-line descendants reflects both Norman and Gaelic Irish ancestry in proportions that vary by family and by generation. The Y-chromosome haplogroup carried by tested male-line Rutledge descendants includes a frequency of R1b-M222, the lineage associated with the population expansion of northwest Ireland and found at elevated levels among men of documented Gaelic Irish male-line descent, at a level that exceeds what would be predicted by a purely English origin surname. The Gaelic Irish had entered the Rutledge line somewhere in the recorded history of County Tipperary, and the Carolina branch of the family carried that signal across the Atlantic without recording it. The Drayton family arrived from Barbados in the earliest years of the colony's settlement. The English origin of the Drayton name is clear. It appears in multiple English counties, associated with the Old English word for a portage, a place where boats were dragged overland between waterways. The Barbadian Draytons arrived in Carolina with capital and established Drayton Hall on the Ashley River, one of the few plantation houses in America that survived the antebellum period without significant structural alteration, and which still stands today as a document in brick and wood of what that economy produced. The genealogy has been carefully maintained across several generations of descendants, and it is among the better documented lines in this group. And yet the Barbadian generation of the Drayton line, the generation that crossed from England to Barbados before the Carolina migration, is the generation for which the documentary record is thinnest. The Barbados of the 1630s and 40s, when the first English settlers arrived on the island, was a society in rapid formation under difficult conditions, and its record-keeping was inconsistent and incomplete. The genetic profile of male-line Drayton descendants carries a Y-chromosome signal that places them within a broad English lineage, as the documentary record would predict. Within that lineage, however, the specific sub-branch they occupy has a geographic distribution that peaks in the West Midlands and in the Welsh borderlands, not in the southern English counties that the family's documented history would suggest as a point of departure. The Welsh marches carried the Drayton line through England before Barbados received them, and the genome kept the record of that earlier geography intact. The Ligare name stands apart from all the others. It is the name most likely to cause confusion in modern South Carolina, where it is pronounced, against all visible logic, Loch Gree, a pronunciation that residents of the state learn early as a test of whether a person actually belongs. The name is French Huguenot, from the same Poitou and Saintonge region that sent the Ravenel and Huger families to Carolina, and the earliest Legare in the colony arrived in the 1680s in the same refugee wave. The Legare line in South Carolina carried a story that the family managed closely for several generations. A branch of the family, documented in the St. Philip's Church Register in Charleston, shows a marriage entry in the 1750s to a woman whose maiden name does not appear in any of the Huguenot refugee lists that survive from the period, whose surname is of undocumented origin, and whose burial record describes her simply as a free woman of the parish. The children of that marriage passed as white in every subsequent census. By the early 1800s, the line was fully embedded in the Carolina planter class, intermarried with families on this list, present at the conventions and the dinners and the events of the St. Cecilia Society, indistinguishable in the public record from any other established Charleston family. The DNA of a documented male-line descendant of that branch, tested through a genealogical service, returned an autosomal result that included sub-Saharan African ancestry. The percentage was small. The genealogical path from the 1750s marriage to the descendant who submitted the test is documented at every step, and the documentary evidence and the genetic signal point in the same direction. The family had managed the record carefully, and the genome had kept its own account. This is how the Carolina aristocracy actually functioned beneath its public record. The official account showed English and French Protestant surnames, Anglican church membership, and land ownership measured in thousands of acres. The private account, the one written into the genome across 8 and 10 and 12 generations of descent, showed something more complicated: Barbadian Atlantic crossings that carried the genetic history of every population Barbados had absorbed, Huguenot refugee networks that moved through communities where Sephardic and Walloon and Swiss populations had already mixed with the French Protestant core, Norman lineages that carried Scandinavian DNA from the Viking settlement of northern France 1,000 years before the Carolina colony was chartered, Old English families in County Tipperary who had intermarried with the Gaelic Irish for 3 centuries before they left for the Atlantic, Danish Danelaw markers in families the record listed as simply English, pre-Roman Atlantic Celtic signals in families the record listed as West Country gentry, and at least one branch where the line between the planter class and the people it claimed authority over was crossed in a church register in the 1750s, and then managed through every subsequent census until the genome made it visible again. The erasure was never complete, because the genome does not erase. It accumulates. Every population that touched these lines left a marker, and every marker is still there, waiting for an analysis precise enough to read it. The 15 surnames that founded the Carolina aristocracy did not arrive from a single identifiable point of origin. They arrived from everywhere the Atlantic world had touched in the preceding 4 centuries, from Barbados and La Rochelle and Brittany and Northamptonshire and County Tipperary and the Alsatian borderlands and the Huguenot communities of London and the border country of Scotland and the Celtic remnant populations of Somerset and Wales. They brought with them the genetic history of every population those places had absorbed across 1,000 years of movement, war, religious displacement, and colonial migration. Each family presented the colony with a version of its origins that was simplified enough to function in a society that needed clear categories: English or French, Protestant or Catholic, planter or tradesman. The simplifications held for as long as the documentary record was the only record anyone could read. So DNA shows what they actually carried beneath those categories: the layered sediment of the Atlantic world, assembled by disaster and religious conflict and colonial ambition into a ruling class that borrowed an English identity that none of its founding families possessed entirely, or without the complications the genome continues to hold in full detail, undimmed by time or by the careful management of a family's public account of itself. The surnames are still on the street signs and the hospital wings and the university endowment chairs of South Carolina. The genealogical societies still meet in Charleston, and the family Bibles still pass from generation to generation with the same names written in the front pages in the same careful hand. The St. Cecilia Society still holds its ball. The plantations that survive still carry the family names on their historical markers. What most of the people who carry those names do not know, because the commercial DNA services they have used were not designed to reach far enough into the haplogroup subbranches to show it, is what those names actually contain below the level the broad regional pie chart reaches. The genetic clock does not care what the census records. It does not care what identity the family presented to its neighbors across 10 generations, or what the church register listed, or what the estate inventory described, or what the College of Arms granted in the way of armorial bearings. It carries the full history of every population that contributed to the line, back to the Norman knights in the Seine-Maritime, and the Huguenot refugees in La Rochelle, and the Barbadian crossings, and the one marriage in the 1750s that a Charleston family spent 2 centuries not discussing. The genome holds all of it, and when the right analysis is run against the right reference populations, it reads back in the order it was deposited, layer by layer, from the Carolina planter class all the way back to whatever shore the line first touched, before history had a name for the people standing on it. If your family name is on this list, look at your DNA results again. Not the broad regional percentages. Look for the sub-branches that do not match the origin story your family has always told. They are there. They have always been there. The genome is not a record that can be edited or sealed or listed differently in the next census. It is the version of the history that nobody could rewrite. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.